Good morning. So, we had taken a look at the game of Omber in the last class, and we'd seen how Pope fuses play with uh, the mock heroic, the aesthetic, and also how uh, the deeply political enters into the playful arena where the violence of colonialism is, as it were, looked at very carefully in the game of Omber. Now, uh, we will, in this particular segment, look at the concluding part of Canto 3, where the rape of the lock actually takes place. And we will, for that matter, go straight into the text. Uh, Now, having completed the game of Omber, Belinda is now engaging, Belinda and the idle aristocratic society now engages in the drinking of tea and coffee. Now, a very quick word before we enter the text. Please remember that by 1660, tea had become one of the most important beverages in England. Tea was, as many of you know, came from China, and it was considered to be uh, a herbal drink of great power. Now, when the British started the process of trading with China, tea, porcelain, silk, etc., were brought back. Now, tea quickly became a rage, and various kinds of tea were exported or imported rather. And you had in during this period particular tea boxes. People would keep different kinds of teas in one box, so that there was jasmine tea, so that there could be cinnamon tea, and so on and so forth. Tea was considered to be an extremely aristocratic drink, which was very, very costly. Yeah, you should not underestimate tea. When you have your humble tea in your little cups of paper or of or your heart, tea was considered to be one of the most expensive drinks during this period, beverages, and it came from China, so it was a colonial object. The second thing that it also was imported from Latin America primarily was coffee, especially Brazil. Brazil was the seat of very high coffee, and therefore, coffee beans were imported from Brazil. So you have in this particular segment references to numerous colonial objects, as it were, and thus you can see that the aristocratic universe of Belinda is marked by the presence of a wealth of objects, a wealth of colonial resources that went into the making of English sophisticated, polished society at this point of time. So, without further ado now, therefore, let's read the text and see how Pope presents this contemporary cultural scenario within the Rape of the Lock. For lo, the board with cups and spoons is crowned the berries crackle and the mill turns round. The berries, of course, would be the coffee beans, and the mill would be the instrument with which the coffee beans are grounded. On shining altars of Japan, they raise. Shining altars of Japan is a periphrasis, roundabout way of talking about the lacquered table. Lacquer was also another colonial import. You will remember that China and Japan, East Asia was famous for its lacquer work, and therefore, in fact, when I went to the Museum of Beijing, I actually took a look at the Chinese museum, which had a history of lacquered art. This is Japanese lacquer. Therefore, on shining altars of Japan, they raise the silver lamp, the fiery spirits blaze. So now it's evening. Now you see how light is quietly changing from the noon when Belinda awakes to now it's evening when the party starts. The silver lamp, the fiery spirits blaze. Once again, notice the splendor of the silver objects which have once again been imported. From silver spouts, the grateful liquors glide. Now, this is the teacup. The teacup, which is made of silver, once again. You see the plenitude, the resources that the people have. From silver spouts, the grateful liquors glide. You see this beautiful description. The grateful liquors, they escape from the teapot, while China's earth receives the smoking tide. China's earth is once again porcelain. As I said, one of the most valuable objects that were imported from China. You had porcelain cups, you had porcelain plates. In fact, the porcelain vases, Ming vases, if you want, were very costly. When you go to the British Museum, as many of you will see there's an entire section on Chinese porcelain, which was considered to be extremely expensive and very intricately crafted. So while China's earth, think of your cup as China's earth, receives the smoking tide, this is the tea, at once they gratify their scent and taste. So tea, or coffee appeals both to your scent and taste. I do not know how many of you have parents or you yourselves are connoisseurs of tea. I am, of course, sort of hooked on to Darjeeling. And you can see that the aroma of Darjeeling tea and its taste is something that is a great favorite. So tea has both, and coffee has both its taste and scent, and frequent cups prolong the rich repast. Right, once again, for those of you who are into cricket will remember that in cricket you have lunch and you have tea. So tea was the aristocrat's drink, cricket was the aristocrat's sport, right? And gradually, of course, tea became cheaper and it became the common man's drink. Incidentally, India had never had a tradition of tea. It was the British who induced us into tea drinking. And there was a hue and cry. For example, the English would very often promote free cups of tea in railway stations, for example. And they would put up big billboards signifying the benefits of tea. If any of you are from Noihati or you have been to the Damdam station, you will still see those boards where the benefits of having tea is being espoused. So tea was a drink that was brought to India by the British. They saw that Chinese tea was becoming very expensive, so they planted tea plantations all across the hills. You had, for example, the Nilgiris, Darjeeling, you have Ceylon. All these are places where tea plantations were made by the British so that they could export and import tea across the globe. So tea has a very rich cultural history, as it were. So, and frequent cups prolong the rich repast. The rich repast, it's the aristocratic world of leisure where you could, drink tea and not work. Straight over round the fair her airy band, some as she sipped the fuming liquor fanned. So once again, the imaginative sylphs, fanning the liquor, as it were, the tea so that it becomes cooler for Belinda. Pope is forever dissolving, you see, these mock heroic moments so that they create this comic, imaginative structure of little laughters, of smiles that we imaginatively think of these little sylphs as fanning the tea. Some over her lap, their careful plumes. Plumes is the wings, displayed, trembling and conscious of the rich brocade. Once again, the cloth, the brocade, as I said, cloth, various kinds of fabric were the largest imports, as it were. So you see, you would have silk from Murshidabad, you would have cotton from Bombay, you would have brocade from another part of the world. And you see, garments, especially fabric, became a very crucial part of the British Empire and the way in which they were processed in Manchester, Liverpool, and the other centers where they were imported into. Coffee, which makes the politician wise and see through things with his half shut eyes. This is a very slight jibe towards the politician who sleeps throughout Parliament. Sent up in vapors to the baron's brain, new stratagems the valiant Locke to gain. So the baron, once again, after coffee, he has this intention of cutting off of the lock of hair, of long possessing Belinda's lock of hair. Cease rash youth, desist ere too late, 'tis too late. Fear the just gods and think of Schuyler's fate. Now, Pope periodically punctuates this mock heroic with epic allusions. What does it do? It creates an epic scale. These allusions create an epic scale where the action of this particular poem is compared with the action of civilizational great wars and conflicts. The allusion here is to Ovid's Metamorphosis. Now, in Ovid's Metamorphosis, this is book 8, there is a battle between King Nisus and the enemy Minos. King Nisus and Minos. And Nisus's daughter was named Scylla. Scylla once saw Minos from the watchtower and fell in love with him. So she betrayed her father by plucking off the purple-colored hair on her father's head, which was supposed to be the kind of protective shield for the city. So the magical hair, which was the protective shield for the city, was plucked by Schuyler from Nisus's head in order to benefit his enemy Minos. In disgust, Minos turned away from Schuyler, and both Nisus and Schuyler were turned into birds. Right. So this is the allusion. So seize rash youth. This is the baron. Desist ere too late. Fear the just gods and think of Schuyler's fate. Change to a bird. Right. So she was transformed, metamorphized into a bird, and said to flit in air, she dearly pays for Nisus's injured hair. Right. So just as Schuyler was punished for sort of plucking Nisus's hair, so also Baron, desist before you two are punished, you two are changed. But when to mischief mortals bend their will, how soon they find fit instruments ill. Now, incidentally, this is a sententia, that if men want to do evil deeds, they will always find a way. Where there is a will, there is a way. That is being said in a roundabout periphrastic manner. Just then, Clarissa drew with tempting grace a two-edged weapon from her shining case. Now, the two-edged weapon, incidentally, is taken from the Bible, the Psalms, where the sword is referred to as a two-edged weapon. It is also used in various other epics, also in Paradise Lost, this two-edged weapon, but in this particular case, this obviously refers to the scissors which the Baron will use. Now, it is interesting that the Baron is handed over the scissors by Clarissa. The Clarissa being the maid of Belinda, what is her motivation? What is the role of Clarissa in this poem? Now, I will discuss this in a separate class, but let me point out two things. One is that, this line was in the original poem of 1712, Clarissa's separate speech was enhanced and put in the 1717 version. So obviously, Clarissa had a role to play in the 1712 edition also. You also have reference to the maid dressing Belinda up, and she is called the inferior priestess, if you remember. Now, there might be two reasons here. One is that Clarissa is jealous of Belinda's beauty. She's inferior in beauty, so she wants a revenge. Two, that Clarissa is also takes a revenge in terms of class, because she belongs to the proletariat, the servant class, whereas Belinda lives a life in aristocratic gentility. So there might be two revenges. One, the feminine revenge of jealousy. Two, the class revenge of the underclass against the privileged. There might be a third reason also, that Clarissa recognizes Belinda's pride and her refusal to submit in marriage to the man. So she becomes an agent of patriarchy and seeks the surrender of Belinda to the Baron. Now, this I will discuss in slightly greater detail when I come to Canto 5. I've just raised a few points here for you to ponder about and think as to why Clarissa would hand over the scissors to the Baron. And then, so ladies in romance assist their knight, present the spear, and arm him for the fight. So part of the romance tradition was that the knight would fight for the lady's honor, and the lady would present the spear or dress the knight up for battle. So Pope is here alluding to the romance tradition. He takes the gift, with reverence and extends the little engine on his fingers' ends. Now, very obviously, the little engine in classical literature, the little engine is always a kind of instrument. It can also refer to the Trojan horse, which was the engine with which, the Trojans were betrayed by the Greeks. So, the Trojan horse was put in Troy, and during the night, the soldiers came out and ransacked Troy. So, the little engine might refer to the Trojan War. It might refer to any kind of instrument. And there's a sexual punning here also. If you read carefully, the little engine might refer to also the male penis or the male organ, and therefore there's a masturbatory sort of suggestion here, in that sense that the little engine on his fingers ends. So you will have to remember that always in Pope, there are multiple meanings at play: the comic, the heroic, the mock heroic, the sexual, the sacred, the profane. So even here, what exactly the little engine means is something that Pope plays with. Now, Pope is playing, therefore, with the language, bringing out the latent meanings, possible latent meanings, and that is the fun of the poem, in identifying what are the ranges of meaning that Pope liberates in the text. So this just behind Belinda's neck he spread, as over the fragrant steams she bends her head. So just as she's about to drink her tea, the Baron wants to cut off the lock of hair. Swift to the lock, 1,000 sprites repair. And you could imaginatively think, once again, a moment of great fun here. All the sylphs immediately rushing to protect Belinda's hair. And thrice they twitched the diamonds in her hair, right? So they can do nothing else. They cannot prevent the Baron from cutting off, but they're twitching the earrings so that Belinda turns back and the Baron withdraws. Thrice she looked back. Once again, notice how the magic numbers are used: 3, 9, 7-fold fence, right? So thrice she looked back, thrice the foe drew near. Just in that instant, anxious Ariel thought the close recesses of the virgin's thought. So Ariel, as it were, now tries to read Belinda's mind. As on the nosegay in her breast it reclined, he watched the ideas rising in her mind. Now remember, Pope has already suggested, as per the Rosicrucian doctrine, that the spirits can only protect the individual if he or she sort of protects her chastity, if she thinks chaste thoughts. If there are thoughts about sexuality, then the sprites or the spirits will lose their power. So he watched the ideas rising in her mind. Suddenly, he viewed, in spite of all her art, an earthly lover lurking at her heart. Now, this is a line of great importance. Many critics have suggested that this earthly lover, which lurks in the heart of Belinda, is actually the Baron. And that, despite her protestations, despite sort of trying to keep her chastity and flirt and not fall in love, Belinda is secretly attracted to the Baron. So once the spirit has seen this fact within Belinda's mind, then he loses all her power. Amazed, confused, he found his power expired, resigned to fate, and with a sigh retired. So there's no longer any defense for Belinda, and Ariel loses his power because within Belinda's heart he has seen an earthly lover, and therefore those vows of chastity, those chaste thoughts have been, as it were, compromised, and therefore Belinda, the spirit, has lost his power. The pier now spreads, the glittering forfex wide. Now, the forfex is the scissor, which is made of silver again. So the glittering forfex, once again a periphrasis, to enclose the lock, now joins it to divide. So he cuts off the lock of hair. Even then, and then comes a very comic passage. Even then, before the fatal engine enclosed, a wretched sylph too fondly interposed. So one sylph tries to come in between the scissor and the hair. Fate urged the shears and cut the sylph in twain, cut the sylph in two. And you see, once again, this is where, there's bloodshed, there's cutting off of the lock, there's cutting off of the sylph. But Pope immediately dissolves this moment of violence through laughter. And that is his strategy, always to dissolve the latent violence through laughter and imagination. So the sylph, what happens to the sylph? In the parenthesis is lines within brackets, but airy substance soon unites again. So the sylph is airy substance, he's already dead, he cannot die any longer. So it unites once again. It's very funny, it's very imaginative, but it's also sort of talks about the violence here. Now, please remember that, the glittering forfex, the fatal engine, the sort of cutting off of the lock of hair are all synecdochic references to the penetration of the female body. Right. In that sense, you will have to remember that despite all the laughter here and the comic and the imaginative, what we are actually witnessing is the male violation of the female without her consent. Right. And therefore, at a certain level, despite reading all the heroic and the mock heroic, you will have to remember that we are, in a certain sense, dealing with a deadly or a very violent act of rape. Now, the rape is, as it were, diluted in the poem by reference to the rape of the lock, and therefore some trivial incident. But you see, what exactly is rape? Now, rape is not merely sexual violation, it's also the violation of the female's agency, what we'll call non consensual act. Right. And therefore, it is a, a frontal attack, I would say, on the very basic aspect of the woman's selfhood. Right. Therefore, this poem, despite its comedy, despite its mock heroic, despite its aesthetics, despite its colonial violence, is also somewhere a very, very, what you could say, subtle exploration into the psychology of rape, of the man's desire to possess the woman's body, and if refused, to violate and possess her, and the woman's reactions, the gamut of the woman's reactions when the rape occurs. So you can read this poem in the context of today's culture as well, where rape is becoming a very common phenomenon, unfortunately, a horrible phenomenon. And despite all the laughter, what is the psychology of rape? And how patriarchy suggests that rape is something which the woman brings upon herself. After all, Belinda has flirted. Belinda has Pope suggests that Belinda has, the Baron has flirted with the Baron. So how patriarchy imposes the rape upon the woman, and then what are the reactions that the woman has, and how, it is justified. Also, if you think very carefully, there's this idea of marital rape, whereby, marriage becomes a way in which the man can possess and rape the wife, whether the wife consents to it or not. And therefore, there are a lot of very complex issues involved here. Now, so far, we've been reading this poem as something very playful, something where colonialism plays a part. But from now on, what we'll do also is to see how the entire poem becomes a poem about female selfhood and the patriarchal perceptions of female selfhood. For those of you who are reading this poem with me, just think about what does it mean, female selfhood, especially the girls in this class who could ask themselves, what is my selfhood all about? And where do the compromises happen? How have I imagined my selfhood with reference to marriage, with reference to sexuality, with reference to interactions? These are issues which Pope is provoking you to think about. And that is where the contemporaneity of this poem lies, not in some old white man cutting off of a lock of hair of some old white woman. There is this issue about rape, non-consent, who owns the female body, what are her reactions all about, what are the patriarchal conceptions. These are some of the most serious issues you need to figure out while reading this poem. Anyways, we will discuss them sometime later on in one of the more general classes. Let me quickly run through the poem now. So, the meeting points, the sacred hairs, dissever from the fair head forever and forever. Then flashed the living lightning from her eyes, and screams of horror rend the affrighted skies. So we talked about one scream of Belinda earlier, the scream when she wins the game of Umber. And this scream was one of great joy, and Pope had warned that this scream will soon dissolve into a scream of grief. Now, this is the moment when that scream happens, the epic scream where, the body of the epic hero is brought in and the wife or the lover sort of grieves over her. So screams of horror rend the affrighted skies. Not louder shrieks to pitying heaven are cast, when husbands or when lapdogs breathe their last. You once again have the Zeugma operating there. So the death of the husband and the death of the lapdog are similar in that sense, that for the woman, Popis, and you can see the misogyny here, that for the woman, the lapdog is as important as the husband. Now, Steele in the Tatler, various other journals also commented on the 18th century woman's fascination with pets, especially, parrots and lapdogs were great favorites, that they were more important to them than the husband. So persistently, you can see in subtle, pinches, as it were, Pope is suggesting that the woman's mind is frivolous, where religion and sex are almost side by side. Her mind is like a vacant toy shop which replaces one man with the other, and therefore she's non-serious about marriage, and the death of the husband and the lapdog remain the same. Or when rich china vessels fallen from high, so porcelain ornaments, cups, etc., when they break, they utter these similar screams. In glittering dust and painted fragments lie. Let wreaths of triumph now my temples twine. The victor cried, the glorious prize is mine. This is the epic scream of the victor hero. Almost reminds you of Achilles' scream after he has killed, and therefore, the Baron screams that I now have the prize. The prize here obviously means Belinda's hair, but very importantly, it could also mean the possession of Belinda's body. While fish in streams or birds delight in air, or in a coach and six the British fair, as long as Atlantis shall be read. Atlantis, the new Atlantis, was a romance which was a salacious romance, almost a scandal literature, published by Mary de la Riviere Manley, right, one of the women writers. So as long as romances shall be read, or the small pillow grace a lady's bed, while visits shall be paid on solemn days, so visitations from one man to the woman or women to the other, when numerous wax lights in bright order blaze, when nymphs take treats or assignations give, so long my honor, name, and praise shall live. Now this is once again the reference to Virgil's Aeneid, where Aeneid talks about the importance of his victories for time eternal. Remember that for the epic, you are talking about eternal time, not only temporality or ephemerality, but you're talking about eternal time and historical time, right? That the name will be inscribed in history of Aeneid, and therefore this speech mirrors that. But obviously, it's more heroic in the sense that it would be forgotten immediately. When what time would spare from steel receives its date, and monuments like men submit to fate, steel could the labor of the gods destroy, and strike to dust the imperial towers of Troy. Now, steel here has two meanings, obviously. One is that, it refers to the epics where Troy was destroyed by the power of the swords, and therefore the power of the human sword to completely destroy human civilization, right? And incidentally, the reference, of course, is that in the creation of Troy, the gods were involved. So the gods laid the foundations of the towers of imperial Troy, which were destroyed by the steel of men. There's also a sexual allusion here. Steel can refer to male hardness, which can destroy Belinda's virginity, as it were. So you can see how beneath the latent surface lies ripples of sexuality, as it were. Steel could the works of mortal pride confound, and hew triumphal arches to the ground. So he's talking about historical battles where Troy is destroyed, and comparing it mock heroically to the cutting off of the lock of Belinda's hair. What wonder then, fair nymph, thy hairs should feel the conquering the conquering, I'm sorry, the conquering force of unresisted steel. Now, the reference, of course, is to Catullus's poem. Catullus was one of the major Greek poets, and Catullus has this poem on Berenice's hair. Berenice's hair is also cut off, and and it is reminded to her that if life can be destroyed and if cities can be destroyed, Berenice's hair too can be cut off. So there is a comparison with the classical Berenice and the rape of her hair and the act of the Baron. So with that, Canto 3 comes to a close. Canto 3 marks the first climax of the poem, the rape of the lock. And this will, in turn, the rape is paralleling the rape of Helen. And therefore, this will now generate the Trojan War, the war between the sexes, the war between the two families, between the Baron and Arabella Fermor's families. And therefore, Canto 4 and Canto 5 will talk about the reactions of the woman and the actual battle that takes place and the resolution of the poem. Now, Pope's problem is, how does he resolve this poem? Now, he cannot give back, the Baron cannot give back the hair, right? His ego will not permit it. And Belinda, even if she gets it back, she's is a woman with only one lock. So perforce she needs to cut off the other lock of her hair, and she has been socially, as it were, maligned. She has become the toast. She has become a subject of gossip, right? Therefore, she is in an extreme position. So there are two extreme positions. The Baron will not give back the lock of hair, and Belinda wants revenge for the rape of the lock. So how does one laugh the two warring families out of this quarrel? How does one resolve the poem? That resolution and that battle will come in Canto 5. But in Canto 4, what we'll observe is the immediate reaction of Belinda. And this reaction will be one of despair, rage, anxiety, and depression. And therefore, it will talk to a large extent about female hysteria. Now, what was female hysteria? What were the ideas about female hysteria? And how does Pope represent this chaotic female hysteria is something which we shall take up in Canto 4. But please remember that Canto 1 and 2, the original version had the two cantos where Pope just wrote about the rape of this lock in a humorous way, right? So this is the core of the poem. It involves the introduction of the invocation and the mock heroic, the description of Belinda as sublime and the mock heroic. It involves the journey to Hampton Court and the mock heroic parallel. It involves the game of Omber and the mock heroic battle. It involves the final cutting off of the lock of hair, the screams and the victor's cries, and the mock heroic parallel referring to the lock of the hair as something that is historically important. So what the first three cantos have actually done is created this pattern of the splendid mock heroic with the imaginative world of the sylphs, the sublime world of Belinda. So Pope has managed successfully to trivialize the epic through the mock heroic, feminize the epic by replacing the martial valor of the male masculine world by the world of the female. So this is an art of feminization of the epic. And thirdly, he has aestheticized it with the presence of the sylphs. Now remember that this is where the sylphs disappear. They will not come back immediately. They will just make a fleeting appearance in Canto 5. So the aesthetic part of the poem is done, right? And this is what the first version would have looked like in two cantos. Now comes Pope's additions to the Rape of the Lock. And these additions, I will argue, are largely patriarchal additions in the sense that these are no longer celebrations of Belinda's world, but advices to how Belinda, the young lady, should behave, and what, the reactions or the hysterical reactions of the woman might be like. Right. So my point therefore remains that the third canto, with its game of umber, with its rich description of colonial objects, celebrates colonialism. It also marks the first climax of the poem, where the rape of the lock actually happens. Now, Canto 4 and 5 will provoke ideas about the reactions to the rape and the resolution of the poem, and very importantly, will give a lot of prominence to Clarissa. But then that remains for another day. We shall take up Canto 4 in one separate lecture in our next class. It is with that then, therefore, that I am bringing this recording to a close with all of your permission.